Sometimes a man runs from his past so long, he forgets what he's really running from. Ephraim Cutter learned that lesson the hard way when flames lit up the Montana sky and forced him to face the truth he'd buried for 10 long years. The 60-year-old mountain man lives alone in his handmade cabin, talking more to animals than people. When wildfire tears through the forest, he hears what sounds like a child crying for help. Racing through the smoke, he finds a dog beside a burned doll, a doll that belonged to a girl who vanished near his land 10 years ago. That disappearance made everyone in town suspect the lonely mountain man. But what really happened to that little girl all those years ago? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Ephraim Cutter had been building his life in reverse for the better part of 60 winters, while other folks accumulated possessions, relationships, and memories they could share around a dinner table. He'd been shedding them like a snake sheds skin, deliberately, methodically, until all that remained was the essential core of a man who'd learned to trust only what his own 2 hands could craft and his own eyes could see. The cabin stood testament to that philosophy. Every log had been felled by his axe, every joint carved with his drawknife, every stone in the foundation placed with the kind of patience that comes from having nowhere else to be and no one waiting for your return. 22 feet by 16 feet of solid timber, chinked tight against Montana winters that could freeze a man's breath in his lungs. The roof was cedar shake he'd split himself, aged silver gray now, and seasoned by a decade of mountain storms. Inside, the space breathed with the rhythm of solitary living. A cast-iron stove dominated one corner, its pipe running straight up through the roof with no unnecessary bends. Ephraim had learned long ago that the shortest path between 2 points wasn't just geometry, it was survival. The stove could heat the entire cabin on a handful of split pine, and when the wind howled down from the high country, that efficiency meant the difference between comfort and suffering. His bed occupied the far corner, a simple frame of lodgepole pine, supporting a mattress he'd sewn from canvas and stuffed with balsam needles that released their forest scent every time he turned in his sleep. Above it hung the only photograph in the cabin, not of family or friends, but of the view from his front door, taken the day he'd finished the roof. It reminded him daily why he'd chosen this particular spot on this particular mountain. Miles from the nearest neighbor and a full day's ride from the town of Cedar Falls. The kitchen, if it could be called that, consisted of a wooden counter built against the west wall, with shelves above holding mason jars filled with dried beans, cornmeal and salt. A hand pump brought clear spring water from the well he dug that first summer, digging 8 feet down through granite-hard earth until he'd struck the vein that had been running beneath this ridge since before the first white. Man set foot in Montana territory. Ephraim measured his days not by clocks, he owned none, but by the angle of sunlight through the single window facing east. Dawn brought him awake as surely as any rooster, and he'd learned to read the sun's position like other men read pocket watches. Morning meant coffee boiled black in a tin pot and cornbread fried in bacon grease. Midday meant checking the snares he'd set along game trails that wound through the pine and aspen. Evening meant wood to split, repairs to make, and the careful maintenance that kept his small world functioning. The autumn of 1887 had painted the mountainside in shades of gold and crimson that reminded him why he'd fallen in love with this country in the first place. Aspen groves shimmered like coins in the breeze, and the high peaks had already received their first dusting of snow that would, by November, grow into the deep blanket that would isolate him completely until spring. He'd been preparing for that isolation with the methodical care of a man who'd learned that oversight in preparation could mean death before the snow melted. The root cellar beneath his cabin held enough supplies to see him through until April. Barrels of salt pork, sacks of beans and flour, and shelves lined with mason jars of vegetables he'd grown in the small garden plot he'd cleared behind the cabin. But this year felt different. He couldn't name the feeling exactly. It wasn't quite unease, but something deeper, like the way animals behave before a storm, restless and alert to changes in air pressure that human senses can't detect. Maybe it was his age catching up with him. 60 winters had a way of reminding a man that his body wasn't the same instrument it had been at 30 or 40. His joints spoke to him now on cold mornings, and tasks that had once been automatic required more conscious effort. Or maybe it was the dreams that had been visiting him with increasing frequency. Dreams that always seemed to feature a child's voice, calling his name from somewhere he couldn't reach. He'd wake with his heart pounding and the taste of smoke in his mouth. Though his stove would be banked low and burning clean, the townspeople of Cedar Falls had never quite known what to make of Ephraim Cutter. When he'd first arrived in 1877, he'd been different from the typical mountain men who drifted through the territory. Quieter, more careful with his words, and carrying himself with a kind of watchfulness that suggested a man familiar with trouble. He'd paid for his supplies with clean silver dollars and never asked for credit or extended conversation. Old-timers remembered him as polite, but distant. The kind of man who'd nod respectfully to ladies and tip his hat, but wouldn't linger for small talk. He'd bought what he needed, tools, seed, basic supplies, and then disappeared into the mountains like smoke dissipating on the wind. Over the years, some folks had tried to draw him out. Martha Henley, who ran the general store, had made occasional attempts at friendly conversation, commenting on the weather or asking after his health. Ephraim would answer directly and honestly, but he never offered information beyond what was asked. And he never asked questions in return. The local pastor, Reverend Morrison, had once ridden out to the cabin to invite Ephraim to Sunday services. Ephraim had received him courteously, offered him coffee, and listened to his invitation with respectful attention. But when the Reverend finished speaking, Ephraim had simply said, "I appreciate the thought, Reverend, but I find my worship in other places." The pastor had ridden back to town with the feeling that he'd encountered a man who'd already made his peace with whatever God he served. Dr. Samuel Hayes, the town's physician, had met Ephraim only twice in 10 years. Once when the mountain man had brought in a wolf pelt to trade for laudanum, explaining that he'd taken a fall and needed something for the pain. And once when he'd quietly purchased a small bottle of carbolic acid. Both times, Dr. Hayes had been struck by Ephraim's knowledge of basic medicine and his careful, precise way of describing symptoms or needs. The sheriff, Tom Bradley, had ridden out to the cabin exactly once, in the spring of 1879, following up on a report from some cowboys who'd claimed they'd seen smoke rising from an area where no one was supposed to be living. Bradley had found Ephraim splitting wood outside his completed cabin, had accepted his explanation that he'd filed a proper claim on the land, and had ridden back to town with the assessment that Ephraim Cutter was exactly what he appeared to be, man who wanted to be left alone and wasn't bothering anybody. That assessment had held true for 8 years, until Sarah McKenna disappeared. The girl had been 7 years old, the daughter of James McKenna, who ran the livery stable in Cedar Falls. Sarah had been playing with 2 other children near the creek that ran behind the town when she'd simply vanished. One moment she'd been there, laughing and throwing stones into the water. The next moment, according to her playmates, she was gone. The search had lasted 3 weeks. Every able-bodied man in the territory had joined the effort, combing through miles of forest, checking every cave and ravine, following every game trail that might have tempted a curious child. They'd found nothing, no tracks, no torn clothing, no sign that Sarah McKenna had ever existed beyond the memories of those who'd loved her. In the absence of evidence, suspicion had gradually focused on the one person in the territory who lived alone, who kept to himself, who had no wife or family to vouch for his character. The whispers had started quietly. Why had no one ever seen Ephraim Cutter in the company of decent folks? What did anyone really know about his past? Why would a man choose to live so far from civilization unless he had something to hide? The whispers had grown louder when someone remembered that Ephraim's cabin lay roughly in the direction Sarah had been facing when she'd last been seen by the creek. The fact that roughly in the direction meant a hard day's walk through difficult country for a grown man, and would have been impossible for a 7-year-old girl, seemed less important than the uncomfortable fact that everyone needed someone to blame. Ephraim had learned about the suspicion gradually, through subtle changes in the way people treated him during his infrequent trips to town. Conversations would stop when he entered the general store. Eyes would follow him as he conducted his business. Children would be quietly called to their mothers' sides when he passed. He'd never addressed the suspicion directly. When Sheriff Bradley had ridden out to ask if he'd seen or heard anything unusual around the time of Sarah's disappearance, Ephraim had answered honestly that he hadn't. When the sheriff had asked if he minded if a few men searched his property, Ephraim had stepped aside and let them look wherever they wanted. They'd found nothing because there was nothing to find. But the absence of evidence had done little to quiet the whispers or ease the suspicion in people's eyes. Over the 2 years since Sarah's disappearance, Ephraim had found his trips to town growing shorter and less frequent. He'd learned to make his supplies last longer, to rely more heavily on what he could hunt and grow himself. The isolation that had once been a choice had gradually become a necessity, and then a prison whose walls were built not of stone and iron, but of rumor and distrust. Now, as he sat on the porch of his cabin watching the first flames of what would become the Great Fire of 1889, Ephraim Cutter was about to learn that some prisons can only be escaped by walking straight through their walls. Even when those walls are made of fire, the smell reached Ephraim before the sight did, that particular acrid bite of burning pine resin mixed with something else, something that made his chest tighten with recognition he didn't want to acknowledge. He'd been splitting kindling behind his cabin when the wind shifted, carrying with it the scent that every man who'd lived through war knew instinctively, the smell of things that weren't meant to burn. He straightened slowly, his axe still gripped in weathered hands, and turned his face toward the western slope, where a thin column of smoke was rising above the tree line, like a gray finger pointing accusations at the sky. Forest fires were common enough in late autumn when the dry season had turned every fallen branch into tinder. But something about this smoke felt different, too dark, too thick, carrying undertones that spoke of structures and belongings rather than just timber and brush. Setting down his axe, Ephraim walked to the front of his cabin and climbed onto the small porch he'd built to face the sunrise each morning. From there, he could see across the valley to where the smoke was thickening, no longer a single column, but spreading into a gray wall that seemed to be moving with purpose through the forest. The wind was picking up, and that was trouble. October winds in Montana could turn a small fire into an inferno that would consume everything in its path. He'd seen it happen before, had fought such fires with other men in other places, and knew that the time for watching was already past. Inside the cabin, he moved with the efficient calm of a man who'd learned to prepare for emergencies without panic. From the wooden chest beside his bed, he pulled out a heavy wool coat and leather gloves. From hooks beside the door, he took down a wet burlap sack he kept for exactly this purpose. He filled 2 canteens with water from his pump and hung them across his shoulder. Then, almost as an afterthought, he opened the top drawer of his small pine desk and removed something wrapped in soft cloth. Unwrapping it carefully, revealed a hand-carved wooden cross, no bigger than his palm, carved from mountain ash and worn smooth by years of handling. The cross was simple, unadorned except for 2 initials carved into its base. SM. He'd carved it 2 years ago, in the long nights after Sarah McKenna's disappearance, when sleep had become elusive and his hands had needed something to occupy them. He'd never intended it as memorial or prayer. Ephraim wasn't sure he believed in prayers anymore, but somehow the act of shaping something beautiful from raw wood had helped quiet the voices in his head that whispered accusations he couldn't answer. Now he tucked the cross into his coat pocket. Though he couldn't have said why, outside the smoke had grown thicker, and he could see the first orange flickers of flame through the trees. The fire was perhaps 2 miles away, but moving in his direction with the wind, pushing it like a living thing. That had caught the scent of prey. Ephraim had started down the slope toward the fire. When he heard it, a sound that stopped him cold and sent ice water through his veins, despite the growing heat in the air. It was thin and desperate, rising above the crackle of burning timber, the cry of someone in mortal terror, a child's cry. For a moment, he stood frozen between rationality and instinct. Rationality told him that no child could be out here miles from the nearest settlement in the path of a spreading wildfire. Rationality reminded him that he'd heard phantom voices before, especially in moments of stress or exhaustion. Rationality warned him that rushing toward a forest fire was exactly the kind of decision that got men killed. But instinct was older and stronger than rationality, and the sound came again, definitely human, definitely young, definitely in desperate need of help. Ephraim broke into a run. The slope was treacherous, covered with fallen logs and loose stones that could turn an ankle or send a man tumbling into the ravine below. But Ephraim had spent 10 years learning every inch of this mountain, and his feet found purchase even as his eyes stayed fixed on the growing wall of flame ahead. The heat hit him like a physical blow when he was still a quarter-mile from the fire. The air shimmered and danced, and breathing became a conscious effort as superheated air seared his lungs. Smoke stung his eyes and made them water, but he pressed forward, following the sound of crying that seemed to come from directly ahead. 20 yards from the fire line, he could see the source of the smoke he'd detected earlier. A small cabin, older and more roughly built than his own, was being consumed by flames that rose 30 feet into the air. The structure was already lost, its roof collapsed and walls falling inward. But something was moving near what had been the front door. Through the smoke and heat shimmer, Ephraim saw a dog, a medium-sized mutt with brown and white markings, standing just outside the ring of flames and barking frantically at something inside the burning cabin. The dog would dart toward the flames, then retreat, whimpering and crying in a way that sounded heartbreakingly human in its desperation. As Ephraim got closer, he could see what had captured the dog's attention. In the doorway of the burning cabin, just visible through the collapsed roof beams, was a child's doll. The doll was partially burned, its dress charred and one arm missing. But it was clearly what the dog was trying to reach. The crying sound he'd heard hadn't been human at all. It had been the dog's desperate attempts to rescue something it perceived as precious. But as Ephraim approached, something about the doll made him stop and look more carefully. Even through the smoke and flames, even with half its features burned away, there was something familiar about it. The remaining fabric of the dress had once been blue calico with small white flowers, a pattern he'd seen before, though he couldn't immediately place where. The dog noticed him then and came running, its tail wagging frantically despite its obvious distress. It ran back toward the burning cabin, barked once at the doll, then returned to Ephraim, as if trying to communicate the urgency of the situation. "Easy, boy," Ephraim said, kneeling to let the dog approach. "Easy there." The dog was uninjured but exhausted, its fur singed in places and its paws blackened with soot. Around its neck was a leather collar, old and worn, with something that looked like metal tags hanging from it. Ephraim gently turned the tags over in his fingers and felt his blood turn cold. Etched into the metal was a name, Patches, and below that, in smaller letters, property of S. McKenna. Cedar Falls, Sarah McKenna, the little girl who disappeared 2 years ago, whose vanishing had made Ephraim the subject of whispered suspicions and careful avoidance. This was her dog, the pet that had disappeared with her and had never been found despite the intensive search that had covered hundreds of square miles. Ephraim looked back at the burning cabin, then at the doll the dog had been trying to save. The blue calico dress, now that he could see it more clearly, was exactly the same pattern Sarah had been wearing. The day she disappeared, he remembered it from the description that had been circulated to every searcher. The cabin was clearly abandoned and had been for some time, judging by the state of the roof and walls, even before the fire. But someone had been here recently. The dog was too well fed to have been surviving on its own for long, and there were signs around the cabin's perimeter of recent human activity. As the flames grew higher and the heat became unbearable, Ephraim made a decision that would change everything. He scooped up the dog and began backing away from the fire. But not before he noticed something else that made his chest tighten with possibilities he didn't want to consider. On the ground near the cabin, partially hidden by fallen leaves but clearly visible once you knew what to look for, was a small wooden cross identical to the one in his pocket. Same size, same wood, same simple carving, except this one bore different initials. E.C. Ephraim Cutter. Someone had been living in this cabin. Someone who knew about Sarah McKenna, who had her dog and her doll, and who had carved a wooden cross bearing Ephraim's own initials. As he carried the dog away from the consuming flames, Ephraim realized that everything he thought he knew about Sarah McKenna's disappearance was about to change. The question was whether he was ready for the truth. Whatever that truth might be, the dog, Patches, according to the worn collar tags, trembled against Ephraim's chest as they climbed back toward his cabin. The smell of smoke and ash heavy in their clothes and lungs. Every few steps, the animal would lift its head and look back toward the burning ruins, whimpering softly as if grieving for something lost in those flames that went beyond a simple doll. Ephraim understood that kind of grief. He'd carried his own version of it for longer than he cared to remember. That weight of things left unsaid and chances that would never come again. But understanding grief and knowing what to do with it were two different matters entirely, and right now he had more pressing concerns than the ache in an old man's chest. Once inside his cabin, he set Patches down gently and watched as the dog immediately began exploring with the focused intensity of an animal trying to make sense of an unfamiliar place. The dog moved methodically from corner to corner, sniffing at chair legs and door frames, pausing to investigate the scents that accumulate in any space where a person lives alone. Ephraim filled a shallow pan with water from his pump and set it on the floor. Patches approached cautiously, then drank deeply, his pink tongue lapping steadily at the clean mountain water. When the dog finished drinking, he sat back on his haunches and looked up at Ephraim with brown eyes that seemed older than any dog's eyes had a right to be. "Well, boy," Ephraim said quietly, settling into his wooden chair. "Looks like we've got ourselves a situation." From his coat pocket, he withdrew the wooden cross he'd carved 2 years ago, Sarah's cross, and set it on the table beside the identical cross he'd retrieved from near the burning cabin. The two pieces sat side by side like questions, waiting for answers that might never come. The cross, bearing his own initials, troubled him more than he wanted to admit. Someone had studied his carving style closely enough to reproduce it almost perfectly. Someone had taken the time to learn the specific techniques he used, the way he beveled the edges, the pattern of small knife marks he left along the arms, even the type of mountain ash he preferred. But more than that, someone had known about his private ritual of carving the cross for Sarah McKenna. That was something he'd never told another living soul. Something he'd done in the solitude of his cabin during long winter nights when sleep wouldn't come and his hands needed occupation. He rose and went to his desk, pulling out the bottom drawer completely to reveal a small hidden compartment he'd built into the back. Inside were 3 more wooden crosses, each bearing different initials. MC for his brother Marcus, who died at Gettysburg. EH for Elizabeth Harper, the woman he'd planned to marry before the war changed everything. And JT for Lieutenant James Turner, who died in Ephraim's arms during the retreat from Richmond. He'd never spoken of these crosses to anyone, never even acknowledged their existence outside the privacy of his own thoughts. They were his way of carrying the dead, his method of keeping faith with people who'd mattered when the world had been a different place, and he'd been a different man. The fact that someone knew about this private practice meant they'd been watching him far more closely than he'd realized. It meant his isolation hadn't been as complete as he'd believed, and that thought sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the cooling autumn air. Patches had curled up near the stove, but his ears remained alert, swiveling toward every small sound from outside. The dog's nervous energy was infectious, and Ephraim found himself listening more intently than usual to the normal sounds of evening settling over the mountain. The whisper of wind through pine boughs, the distant call of an owl, the soft settling of cooling wood in the cabin's walls. But underneath those familiar sounds was something new. The distant crackle of the continuing fire, and carried on the wind, voices. Human voices, still far away but moving in his direction. He went to the window and peered through the growing dusk toward the valley below. Pinpoints of light flickered through the trees, lanterns or torches carried by people moving up the mountain paths. A search party, most likely, coming to investigate the fire and perhaps to offer assistance to anyone who might have been affected. Under normal circumstances, Ephraim would have welcomed the help. Forest fires were dangerous enough that any reasonable man would appreciate additional hands and eyes. But these weren't normal circumstances, and the discovery of Sarah McKenna's dog and belongings complicated everything in ways he was only beginning to understand. He had perhaps an hour before the search party reached his cabin, maybe less if they were moving faster than the lights suggested. An hour to decide what he was going to tell them about Patches, about the burned cabin, about the crosses that connected him to a mystery he'd never wanted any part of. The smart thing would be to turn the dog over to the searchers immediately, to explain about the burning cabin and let them draw their own conclusions about what it might mean. That would get the animal back to people who could properly care for him and might provide answers about what had happened to Sarah McKenna 2 years ago. But something held him back from that simple solution. Maybe it was the way Patches had looked at him when they'd first met, with a recognition that seemed to go beyond the normal wariness of a strange dog meeting a strange man. Maybe it was the careful way someone had reproduced his carving style on that second cross, suggesting a level of attention and planning that made his skin crawl. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe it was the growing certainty that turning over the dog would mean answering questions he wasn't prepared to answer, facing suspicions that had already nearly destroyed his peace once before. As the voices grew closer, Ephraim made a decision that surprised him with its immediacy and certainty. He went to his cupboard and pulled out a canvas pack, the same one he'd used during his military service years ago. Working quickly, he filled it with essential supplies. Dried meat, hardtack, a small pot for cooking, matches wrapped in oiled cloth, and a spare set of warm clothes. From his gun rack, he took down his Winchester rifle and a box of cartridges. Not because he expected trouble, he told himself, but because a man traveling alone in wilderness country was a fool if he went unarmed. Patches watched these preparations with interest, his head tilted as if trying to understand what was happening. When Ephraim shouldered the pack and picked up his rifle, the dog stood and moved toward the door, tail wagging slightly. "You think we're going somewhere, boy?" Ephraim asked quietly. The dog's response was to nose at the door and look back at him expectantly. The voices were closer now, close enough that he could make out individual words carried on the night air. Someone was calling instructions about staying together, about watching for hot spots from the fire. Someone else was mentioning his name, wondering if the mountain man was all right. Ephraim looked around his cabin one more time, at the home he'd built with his own hands and the life he'd carefully constructed in its walls. Then he opened the door and stepped out into the night, Patches close at his heels. Whatever answers lay hidden in the ashes of that burned cabin, whatever truth connected Sarah McKenna's disappearance to the mysterious crosses, he was going to find them himself. Before the whispers started again, before the suspicion returned, before his carefully guarded peace was shattered by questions he might not be able to answer, the search party's lights were perhaps 20 minutes away when Ephraim and Patches disappeared into the darkness of the Montana forest, leaving behind everything except the truth they were determined to find. The night forest had a way of stripping away everything except the essential business of staying alive. Every footfall had to be considered, every branch pushed aside with care to avoid the snap that might carry sound to unwanted ears. Ephraim moved through the darkness with the practiced silence of a man who'd learned stealth in places where noise meant death, and Patches seemed to understand the need for quiet, padding softly beside him without so much as a whimper. They'd been walking for 2 hours when Ephraim found what he'd been looking for, an old trapper's shelter built into the face of a limestone cliff, hidden behind a screen of young pines that had grown up since the structure was abandoned. He'd discovered the place years ago during one of his hunting expeditions and had made note of it as the kind of refuge a man might need if circumstances ever required him to disappear for a while. The shelter was crude but functional. 3 walls of stacked stone with a roof of split logs covered in bark and earth. The front was open to the elements, but the overhang provided protection from rain and snow, and the back wall had been blackened by countless fires, built by men who'd needed warmth and anonymity more than comfort. Inside, Ephraim found the fire ring exactly as he'd left it during his last visit 3 summers ago. He gathered dry tinder and kindling from the supply he'd cached behind a loose stone in the back wall, and soon had a small, nearly smokeless fire burning. The flames threw dancing shadows on the stone walls and provided just enough light to see by without creating the kind of beacon that might draw unwanted attention. Patches explored the small space methodically, as he had back in the cabin, but seemed to approve of their new accommodations. He settled near the fire with a soft sigh, his muzzle resting on his front paws, but his ears still alert to every sound from the forest beyond. Ephraim sat on a flat stone that served as a crude chair and pulled out the 2 wooden crosses, setting them side by side in the firelight. In the flickering orange glow, the differences between them became even more apparent. His own carving showed the slight irregularities that came from working by lamplight during long winter evenings. The mysterious duplicate was too perfect, too precise, as if it had been carved by someone working from detailed drawings rather than from memory or inspiration. From his pack, he withdrew a leather-bound journal he'd been keeping sporadically for the past decade. Not a diary exactly, but a record of observations about weather patterns, animal behavior, and the subtle changes that marked the passage of seasons in the high country. He'd started it as a practical matter, a way of tracking information that might be useful for hunting or predicting harsh weather. But over the years, it had become something more personal. Now he opened it to a blank page and began to write by firelight, setting down everything he could remember about the burned cabin and its contents. The construction style, log walls with poor chinking, a roof that had been failing even before the fire. The evidence of recent habitation, cleared ground around the structure, a well-worn path leading away into the forest, signs that someone had been dumping ash from a stove. Most importantly, he drew careful sketches of both wooden crosses, noting every detail he could observe. The type of wood, the tool marks, the specific way the corners had been beveled. If he was going to solve this mystery, he needed to document everything before memory began to play tricks on him. As he worked, Patches suddenly lifted his head and stared toward the mouth of the shelter. His ears were pricked forward and his body tense, but he made no sound. Ephraim set down his journal and listened carefully to the night sounds beyond their small circle of firelight. At first, he heard nothing unusual, just the whisper of wind through pine needles and the distant call of a night bird. But then, carried on the breeze, came the sound of voices. Still far away, but definitely human, and definitely moving in their direction. Ephraim quickly smothered the fire, scattering the burning twigs and covering them with dirt until no trace of flame remained. In the sudden darkness, he and Patches sat perfectly still, listening to the voices grow gradually closer. "Should check every shelter and cave in the area," someone was saying. A man's voice, unfamiliar to Ephraim but carrying the authority of someone used to giving orders. "Waste of time if you ask me," came a second voice, younger and less patient. "Old mountain man probably just headed deeper into the back country. Could be 50 miles from here by now. Maybe, but Sheriff Bradley wants every possibility checked. McKenna's beside himself about the dog, and if there's even a chance the animal might lead us to answers about what happened to his daughter. The voices faded as the speakers moved past the hidden entrance to the shelter. But Ephraim had heard enough to understand the situation. James McKenna, Sarah's father, was part of the search party. The man was still looking for his daughter after 2 years, still hoping that some trace of her might be found. Ephraim felt a stab of guilt that surprised him with its intensity. Here was a father who'd never stopped searching, never stopped hoping, while Ephraim had withdrawn into isolation and tried to forget that Sarah McKenna had ever existed. The wooden cross in his pocket suddenly felt like a mockery, rather than a memorial. What right did he have to grieve privately for a child he'd barely known when her own father was still out in the night looking for answers? When the voices had faded completely into the distance, Ephraim carefully rebuilt his fire, keeping it even smaller than before. By its dim light he returned to his journal, but now his writing had a different purpose. Instead of simply recording observations, he began to piece together a timeline of everything he knew about Sarah McKenna's disappearance. The facts were simple enough. A 7-year-old girl had vanished while playing by the creek behind Cedar Falls on a September afternoon in 1887. She'd been with 2 other children, but they'd been distracted by their play and hadn't noticed exactly when she'd disappeared. The search had lasted 3 weeks and covered hundreds of square miles, but no trace of her had ever been found. What troubled Ephraim now, writing by firelight with Patches sleeping peacefully beside him, was how little he'd actually paid attention to the details of the case when it was happening. He'd been so focused on avoiding suspicion, so careful to stay out of the way of the search parties, that he'd never really considered what might actually have happened to the child. Now, with her dog sleeping at his feet and her burned doll fresh in his memory, those details seemed crucial. Someone had been living in that cabin with Sarah's belongings. Someone who knew enough about Ephraim's private habits to reproduce his carving style. Someone who had deliberately left clues pointing in his direction. The question that kept him awake long into the night was whether that someone was Sarah McKenna herself, or whether it was the person who'd taken her away. Dawn came grey and cold, with the kind of mountain mist that turned familiar landmarks into ghostly suggestions of themselves. Ephraim woke to find Patches already alert, sitting at the mouth of the shelter with his ears pricked towards some sound or scent that human senses couldn't detect. The dog's stillness had an intensity that made Ephraim reach instinctively for his rifle before he was fully conscious. The forest was quiet in the way that meant something was wrong. No birdsong, no rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush, no ordinary sounds of a wilderness waking up. Just silence, heavy and waiting, like the moment before thunder follows lightning. Ephraim gathered his gear quickly and silently, stuffing his journal and the wooden crosses into his pack while keeping his rifle close at hand. Whatever Patches was sensing, they needed to be ready to move. The shelter had served its purpose, but lingering too long in any one place was a luxury they couldn't afford. As they prepared to leave, Patches suddenly trotted to the back corner of the shelter and began pawing at something half buried under fallen leaves and debris. Ephraim followed and saw what had caught the dog's attention, a small piece of blue fabric, faded and dirty, but unmistakably the same calico pattern as the burned doll's dress. The fabric was wrapped around something hard and rectangular. Ephraim carefully unwrapped it to reveal a child's slate board, the kind used in one-room schoolhouses across the territory. Most of the writing had been erased or weathered away, but he could still make out faint chalk marks forming letters, S-A-R-A-H, written in a child's careful script across the top. And below that, repeated several times as if in practice, "I am safe." The slate board hit Ephraim like a physical blow. This wasn't just another clue pointing to Sarah McKenna. This was evidence that she'd been alive at least long enough to write these words. The handwriting was shaky but determined, the letters formed with the concentration of a child trying to communicate something important. But when had she written it? The slate was weathered, suggesting it had been exposed to the elements for some time, but not so badly damaged that it couldn't have been placed here recently. And why here, in this particular shelter that Ephraim had discovered by chance years ago? Unless it wasn't chance at all. The thought came to him gradually, like cold water seeping through wool. What if someone had been watching him for years, learning his habits, mapping his movements? What if they'd known about this shelter because they'd followed him here before? He looked around the small space with new eyes, searching for other signs that someone else had been here. In the back wall, behind where the slate had been hidden, he found what he was looking for, fresh scratches in the stone, the kind that came from someone repeatedly moving a loose rock to access a hiding place. And when he worked the rock free, he discovered a small cavity that contained more items wrapped in oiled cloth, a child's hair ribbon, blue silk that matched the dress fabric, a small wooden toy horse, crudely carved but painted with care. A folded piece of paper that, when opened, revealed a map drawn in the same childish handwriting as the slate. The map showed the area around Cedar Falls with surprising accuracy for a child's work. The creek where Sarah had disappeared was clearly marked, as was the town itself. But most interesting was a dotted line that led from the creek into the mountains, ending at a small square marked Safe Place with an arrow pointing north. Ephraim studied the map carefully, comparing it to his own knowledge of the terrain. The route marked on the paper would be difficult, but not impossible for someone who knew the country well. It avoided the main trails and kept to areas where a person could move without being easily spotted. The Safe Place appeared to be located somewhere near the abandoned mining claims that dotted the high country north of his cabin. But what troubled him most was how accurate the map was. The creek bends were precisely drawn, the elevation changes correctly indicated, the major landmarks all properly positioned. This wasn't the work of a 7-year-old child lost in the wilderness. This was the product of someone who knew the country intimately and had taken considerable time to create an accurate representation. Patches had been watching him examine the items with an intensity that seemed almost human in its focus. Now the dog moved to the mouth of the shelter and looked back at him expectantly, as if waiting for a decision about which direction to go. "You know something about all this, don't you, boy?" Ephraim said quietly. "You know where she is." The dog's response was to nose at the map in Ephraim's hands, then trot a few steps toward the north, the same direction indicated by the arrow on the child's drawing. Ephraim made his decision. Folding the map carefully and tucking it into his coat pocket along with the wooden crosses, he shouldered his pack and followed Patches out into the misty morning. If Sarah McKenna was alive somewhere in the high country, if she'd somehow survived 2 years in the wilderness, then she deserved to be found by someone who would help her rather than exploit her situation. But as they climbed higher into the mountains, following game trails that seemed familiar to Patches, Ephraim couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into a trap. The evidence was too convenient, too perfectly placed to guide him in a specific direction. Someone wanted him to find these clues, wanted him to follow this particular route into increasingly isolated country. The question was whether that someone was Sarah McKenna herself, trying to guide a rescuer to her location, or someone else entirely, someone who had been planning this confrontation for a very long time. By midday, they'd climbed above the tree line into country where the wind carried the sharp bite of early winter. Here, among the scattered boulders and hardy mountain grass, Patches suddenly stopped and began barking, not the desperate sound Ephraim had heard at the burning cabin, but sharp, excited barks that spoke of recognition. In the distance, barely visible against the grey stone of a rocky outcropping, was a thin column of smoke rising straight up in the still air. Someone was up there, someone with a fire and the confidence to let its smoke be seen. Ephraim checked his rifle and started climbing toward the smoke, Patches bounding ahead with an energy that suggested they were very close to whatever answers lay waiting in the high country. The climb took them through country. That would have been treacherous for anyone unfamiliar with high mountain terrain. Loose shale shifted underfoot, and the thin air made every step an effort that left Ephraim's lungs burning despite his years of living at altitude. But Patches moved with the confidence of an animal following a well-known path, pausing occasionally to look back and make sure his human companion was keeping up. As they approached the source of the smoke, Ephraim could make out more details of the camp. It was situated in a natural shelter formed by 3 large boulders that created walls on 3 sides, with the 4th side open to the south for light and warmth. Someone had built a lean-to against one of the boulders using pine poles and bark, creating a structure that would be nearly invisible from any distance greater than a few hundred yards. The fire was small and well managed, producing just enough smoke to be seen by someone who knew where to look, but not enough to create a beacon that would draw unwanted attention. Whoever was up there understood the art of staying hidden while remaining findable by the right person. 50 yards from the camp, Patches suddenly stopped and sat down, looking back at Ephraim with an expression that seemed to say, "This is as far as I go. The rest is up to you." Ephraim approached the final distance alone, his rifle held ready but not threatening, his eyes scanning the camp for any sign of movement. The fire was definitely tended. He could see fresh wood stacked nearby and the kind of organized arrangement that spoke of someone who'd been living here for some time rather than just passing through. "Hello," he called softly. "I'm coming up to your camp. I've got your dog with me." For a long moment there was no response. Then from somewhere behind the lean-to came a voice that made Ephraim's heart stop. "I know who you are," the voice said. It was young, female, and carried the careful pronunciation of someone who'd been practicing speaking to adults. "You're Ephraim Cutter. You're the man they think took me." A girl emerged from behind the shelter, and Ephraim found himself looking at Sarah McKenna, or rather, at who Sarah McKenna had become during 2 years of living wild in the Montana mountains. She was taller than the 7-year-old who'd disappeared, her limbs showing the gangly growth of a child approaching adolescence. Her hair, once blonde and carefully braided, now hung in dark tangles past her shoulders. Her clothes were a mixture of items that looked like they'd been scavenged from various sources. Men's pants cut down to fit, a wool coat that was too large for her frame, boots that had been mended with strips of leather, but her eyes were what struck him most. They were alert and intelligent, but they held a wariness that no 9-year-old should possess, the kind of watchfulness that came from having to survive on one's own in circumstances that would have broken most adults. "Sarah," he said quietly, setting his rifle aside and sitting down on a nearby rock to make himself less imposing. "Your father's been looking for you." "I know," she replied, staying well back from him but not fleeing. "I've seen the search parties. I've watched them from hiding places in the rocks. Why didn't you call out to them? Why didn't you let them know you were alive?" Sarah's expression grew complicated, mixing fear with something that might have been shame. "Because I wasn't supposed to be alive," she said finally. "Because someone told me that if I ever came back to town, if I ever told anyone what really happened, they'd hurt my father and my mother. They'd hurt everyone I cared about." Ephraim felt ice water in his veins. "Who told you that, Sarah?" Instead of answering directly, she reached into a leather pouch she wore at her waist and pulled out something wrapped in cloth. When she unfolded it, Ephraim saw that it was a silver locket, tarnished but still bearing the engraved initials SM on its face. "This belonged to my grandmother," Sarah said, holding the locket carefully. "My father gave it to me on my 7th birthday, just a few weeks before I disappeared. The man who took me made me wear it every day as a reminder of what I'd lost, what I could never go back to." She opened the locket to reveal a small photograph inside, a daguerreotype of a woman who looked remarkably like Sarah, with the same blonde hair and delicate features. "He told me stories about my family," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "But not the kind of stories a child should hear. He told me about all the ways people could be hurt, all the things that could happen to them if someone wanted to cause pain. He made me understand that staying hidden was the only way to keep everyone safe." "Sarah," Ephraim said gently, "who was this man?" What did he look like? Her answer made his blood run cold. He looked like you, she said simply. He was tall and had grey in his beard and spoke quietly, like you do. He wore clothes like yours and carried himself like a man who'd spent time in the mountains. That's why he chose you to blame, Mr. Cutter, because he knew that if people were looking for someone who could have taken me and kept me hidden in the wilderness, they'd naturally think of the mountain man who lived alone and didn't talk to anyone. The pieces were beginning to come together in Ephraim's mind, forming a picture that was both clearer and more disturbing than anything he'd imagined. Someone had deliberately taken Sarah McKenna and kept her alive, not for ransom or for any immediate purpose, but as part of a long-term plan to destroy Ephraim's reputation and peace. Where is he now? Ephraim asked. The man who took you. Sarah's expression grew fearful again. I don't know, she whispered. He left me here 3 days ago and said he had business to take care of. He said he'd be back soon, and that when he returned, we'd finally finish what we started. She looked toward the valley below, where smoke from the forest fire was still visible in the distance. But then the fire started, and I got scared that something had happened to him. That's when Patches ran away. He was trying to get back to the cabin where we'd been staying before we came up here. Ephraim followed her gaze toward the smoke, and felt understanding dawn like a cold sunrise. The burned cabin, the carefully placed clues, the wooden cross bearing his initials, it had all been preparation for this moment. Someone had spent 2 years planning an elaborate frame that would finally destroy any doubt about Ephraim's guilt in Sarah's disappearance. And now that person was somewhere down in the valley, probably watching the search parties, probably waiting to see if Ephraim would take the bait and lead everyone straight to Sarah's hiding place. The trap wasn't just closing, it was already sprung. The only question now was whether Ephraim could find a way to get Sarah to safety before her. Captor returned to finish whatever plan he'd been nurturing for 2 long years. The sound reached them before the sight did. Horses, moving through the rocky terrain below, their hooves striking stone with the deliberate rhythm of animals being ridden rather than running wild. Ephraim and Sarah both froze, listening to the approaching riders with the shared understanding that discovery might mean death for both of them. How many men know about this place? Ephraim whispered, but Sarah was already shaking her head. Nobody knows about this camp, she said, her voice tight with fear. He chose it because you can't see it from any of the main trails, and the only way up here is through country too rough for most people to bother with. But someone was bothering with it now. As the hoofbeats grew closer, Ephraim could make out voices, at least 3 men, maybe 4, talking among themselves as they navigated the treacherous ascent. And one of those voices was familiar, though it took him a moment to place it. Sheriff Tom Bradley. Sarah, Ephraim said quietly, I need you to listen to me very carefully. I think someone led the sheriff's party up here deliberately. Someone who wanted them to find us together. Her eyes widened as she understood the implication. If the searchers found Ephraim alone with Sarah in a remote mountain camp, it would confirm every suspicion that had ever been whispered about him. No one would believe that he'd come here to rescue her. The evidence would all point to a guilty man finally caught with his victim. We have to run, Sarah whispered. But Ephraim was already shaking his head. There's nowhere to run to, child. They're coming up the only path that leads away from here, and this country's too open for us to hide. He looked at her seriously. Besides, running would only make me look more guilty than I already do. The voices were close enough now that they could make out individual words. Sheriff Bradley was talking to someone about following tracks, about signs that someone had been living rough in the high country. Another voice, one that Ephraim recognized as belonging to James McKenna, Sarah's father, was saying something about not getting their hopes up, about how many false leads they'd followed over the past 2 years. Mr. Cutter, Sarah said suddenly, her voice urgent. The man who took me, he said something strange before he left. He said he'd been waiting a long time for this moment, that he'd finally found a way to make you pay for something you did to him years ago. Ephraim felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Did he tell you what I was supposed to have done? "He said you killed his brother," Sarah replied. "During the war. He said his brother died because you gave an order that sent him into an ambush, and that he spent years tracking you down to get his revenge." The pieces clicked into place with a clarity that was almost painful. Someone who blamed him for a death during the war. Someone who'd taken the time to learn his habits and plan an elaborate revenge. Someone who'd been patient enough to wait years for the perfect opportunity to destroy not just Ephraim's life, but his reputation and any chance of peace he might have found. The problem was that Ephraim had given many orders during the war, had sent many men into situations where some lived and some died. Without more information, he had no way of knowing which brother, which battle, which of the countless small tragedies that accumulated during 4 years of fighting had created this particular enemy. The hoofbeats stopped perhaps 50 yards below their position. Ephraim could hear the men dismounting, could hear Sheriff Bradley giving quiet instructions about spreading out and searching carefully. They'd be at the camp within minutes. "Sarah," he said quietly, "when they get here, I want you to run straight to your father. Don't stop, don't look back. Just get to him as fast as you can. Whatever happens after that, whatever they think about me. The important thing is that you're safe and back with your family." But Sarah was shaking her head, her young face set with a determination that reminded him painfully of her father. "That's not right, Mr. Cutter. You came up here to help me, and I'm not going to let them think you're the one who hurt me." Before Ephraim could stop her, Sarah stood up and walked to the edge of their small camp, where she could be seen by the approaching searchers. "Papa!" she called out in a voice that carried clearly across the rocky terrain. "Papa, I'm up here! I'm safe!" The effect was immediate and electric. James McKenna's voice rose in a shout that echoed off the surrounding peaks. "Sarah! Sarah!" And suddenly the careful search pattern dissolved as the men below abandoned caution and scrambled up the rocky slope toward the sound of his daughter's voice. Ephraim set his rifle aside and stood with his hands clearly visible, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether he lived or died. The first man to reach the camp was James McKenna, and the sight of his daughter, alive, standing, unharmed, drove him to his knees as if he'd been struck by lightning. "Sarah," he gasped, reaching for her with shaking hands. "Oh, sweet Lord, Sarah, we thought you were dead." She ran to him then, this child who'd survived 2 years of captivity and isolation, and let herself be a little girl again in her father's arms. But even as she clung to him, she was talking rapidly, explaining about the man who'd taken her, about Ephraim coming to rescue her, about the elaborate plot that had been designed to frame an innocent man. Sheriff Bradley arrived next, his gun drawn and his eyes fixed on Ephraim with the kind of suspicion that could turn deadly in an instant. Behind him came Dr. Hayes and 2 other men Ephraim didn't recognize, all of them staring at the scene with expressions that mixed relief at finding Sarah alive with confusion about what it all meant. "Step away from the girl." "Oh, Cutter," Bradley said quietly, his revolver trained on Ephraim's chest. "Sheriff," Ephraim said calmly, "I think you need to listen to what Sarah has to say before you make any decisions about what happened here." But even as Sarah tried to explain, even as she told them about her captor and the plan to frame Ephraim, the sheriff's expression remained skeptical. 2 years of believing one story made it difficult to accept another, especially when that story seemed to exonerate the primary suspect. It was then that the real shock came. "I'm afraid Sarah's been through a terrible ordeal," came a new voice from behind the group. "Poor child's been in the wilderness so long. She's confused about who helped her and who hurt her." Everyone turned to see the newcomer climbing up to join them, a tall man with graying hair and mountain clothes, carrying himself with the easy confidence of someone familiar with rough country. Ephraim had never seen him before, but there was something about his face, something about the way he moved, that seemed familiar. "Dr. Morrison," Sheriff Bradley said with obvious relief. "Thank God you were able to follow our trail up here. The child's been saying some strange things." Dr. Morrison, not the town's physician, Dr. Hayes, but someone else entirely. Someone the sheriff clearly knew and trusted. Someone who'd apparently been following the search party. And suddenly, With the clarity of absolute certainty, Ephraim understood the full scope of the trap that had been laid for him. The man climbing toward them wasn't a doctor at all. He was Sarah's captor, the person who'd spent 2 years planning this moment. He'd followed the search party up the mountain, timing his arrival perfectly to witness Ephraim's apparent guilt and to ensure that Sarah's testimony would be dismissed as the confused ramblings of a traumatized child. "Sarah," the man said gently, approaching her with the kind of professional manner that immediately put the other adults at ease. "You're safe now. No one's going to hurt you anymore." But Sarah took one look at him and screamed. Sarah's scream cut through the mountain air like broken glass, high and desperate and filled with a terror that froze every man present. She scrambled backward away from the approaching figure, clinging to her father with a desperation that spoke of horrors no child should have endured. "That's him," she cried, her voice breaking with panic. "That's the man who took me. Papa, don't let him near me." The effect on the group was immediate but confused. James McKenna instinctively pulled his daughter closer, his face a mask of bewilderment as he looked between Sarah and the man she was accusing. Sheriff Bradley's gun wavered, uncertain now which direction to point it, while Dr. Hayes stepped forward with the professional concern of a physician seeing a child in distress. "Now, Sarah," the man said in that same gentle, reasonable tone, "you're confused, sweetheart. I'm Dr. Morrison. I've been helping search for you all this time. You're safe now." But his words only made Sarah's panic worse. She buried her face against her father's shoulder, shaking with sobs that seemed to come from the deepest places of fear and trauma. Ephraim watched the scene unfold with the terrible clarity of understanding. This man, whoever he really was, had planned for this moment with meticulous care. He'd established himself in the community, gained the trust of the sheriff and other local authorities, positioned himself perfectly to discredit anything Sarah might say when she was finally found. "Sheriff," Ephraim said quietly, "I think you need to consider the possibility that the child knows what she's talking about." Bradley's eyes snapped to him, hard and suspicious. "You're hardly in a position to be giving advice, Cutter. We found you alone with the girl in a remote camp, just like everyone always suspected, because someone wanted you to find us together," Ephraim replied. "Someone who's been planning this for a very long time." The man calling himself Dr. Morrison stepped closer to the group, his movements casual but purposeful. Ephraim noticed that he kept one hand near the coat pocket where a pistol might be concealed, and his eyes never left Sarah's face. "The poor child has been through a terrible ordeal," Morrison said, his voice carrying the authority of medical knowledge. "It's not uncommon for victims of prolonged trauma to become confused about their captors, to transfer their fear onto innocent people while protecting those who actually harmed them. It's a well-documented psychological phenomenon." The explanation was smooth, professional, and completely believable to men who had no reason to doubt the word of someone they'd accepted as a doctor. Even James McKenna seemed to be wavering, looking down at his daughter with the kind of uncertainty that comes when medical authority contradicts a child's testimony. But Ephraim had spent enough time with Sarah to recognize something the others couldn't see. Despite her terror, despite her tears, her eyes were alert and calculating. She was afraid, but she was also thinking, trying to figure out how to convince the adults of a truth they were predisposed to reject. "Papa," she said suddenly, pulling back to look directly into her father's face. "Remember the story you used to tell me about Grandmama's locket? About how she hid it from the soldiers who came to our farm?" James McKenna blinked, clearly caught off guard by the non sequitur. "Sarah, what does that have to—" "You said she hid it in the well," Sarah continued urgently. "You said she dropped it down the well and told the soldiers she'd never owned such a thing, because she knew they'd take it away from her if they found it." Understanding began to dawn in her father's eyes. This was something only Sarah would know, a family story that had never been shared outside their immediate household. "This man made me wear Grandmama's locket every day," Sarah said, her voice growing stronger. "He said it was to remind me of what I'd lost, what I could never have back. But Papa, I never lost it. You gave it to me on my birthday, remember? You said it was time for it to have a new guardian." She reached into her pouch and pulled out the silver locket, holding it up so everyone could see the familiar engraving. James McKenna stared at it as if seeing a ghost, his face going pale with recognition. "My God," he whispered. "Sarah, how do you still have this? We searched your room after you disappeared and it was gone. We thought whoever took you had—" "He made me take it with me," Sarah said simply. "He knew about it because he'd been watching our house, watching our family. He knew it was precious to me, so he used it to hurt me." The man calling himself Dr. Morrison stepped forward again, his manner still calm, but with something harder underneath now. "Sheriff, I really think we need to get this child to proper medical attention. She's clearly—" "Don't." The voice that cut him off belonged to James McKenna, and it carried a father's absolute authority. "Don't you dare tell me my daughter doesn't know what happened to her." McKenna stood slowly, still holding Sarah protectively, and for the first time since arriving at the camp, he looked directly at Ephraim. "Mr. Cutter, I owe you an apology, and probably my life." "You don't owe me anything, McKenna," Ephraim replied. "You just need to get your daughter away from here safely." But even as he spoke, Ephraim was calculating distances and angles, trying to figure out how many of the men present were armed and which direction trouble was most likely to come from. The man masquerading as Dr. Morrison had the look of someone whose careful plans were falling apart, and desperate men often made deadly decisions. Sheriff Bradley was the key variable. His gun was still drawn, but his attention was divided between Ephraim and the growing tension around Morrison. If shooting started, Bradley's first instinct would be to protect the civilians, but his confusion about who was actually dangerous could get everyone killed. "Sheriff," Ephraim said carefully, "I think you should ask Dr. Morrison some questions about his medical credentials, like which medical school he attended or where he practiced before coming to Cedar Falls." Morrison's response was immediate and telling. Instead of providing the requested information, he took a step backward and his hand moved definitively toward his coat pocket. "That's enough," he said. And now his voice carried none of the gentle authority he'd been projecting. "I've waited too long and planned too carefully to let this fall apart now." The gun that appeared in his hand was a Colt .45, well-maintained and held with the confidence of someone who knew how to use it. He kept it pointed generally toward the group while his eyes fixed on Ephraim, with an intensity that spoke of years of accumulated hatred. "You really don't remember, do you?" Morrison said, his mask of professional courtesy finally dropping away. "Battle of Chancellorsville, May 2nd, 1863. You were a lieutenant then, leading a reconnaissance patrol that was supposed to scout Confederate positions south of the Rappahannock." The memory hit Ephraim like a physical blow. Chancellorsville had been a disaster for the Union forces, a battle where confusion and miscommunication had led to unnecessary casualties and tactical failures. He remembered the reconnaissance mission, remembered the orders that had seemed clear at the time, but had led his small patrol straight into a Confederate ambush. 3 men died in that ambush, Morrison continued, his voice growing colder. 3 good men who trusted your judgment and followed your orders into hell. One of them was my brother, Private Daniel Morrison. He was 19 years old, and he died calling for his mother while Confederate bullets tore him apart. "I remember," Ephraim said quietly. "I remember all of them. Daniel Morrison, Corporal Hayes, and Private Richardson. I've carried their names for 26 years. But you got to go home after the war," Morrison snarled. "You got to live and build a life and find peace in these mountains, while my brother rotted in Virginia soil. Do you have any idea what that does to a family? What it did to my mother, losing her youngest son to your incompetence?" Ephraim could see the pain behind the anger, the kind of grief that had festered and turned poisonous over decades of nurturing. This was about more than revenge. This was about a man who'd never learned to carry loss without letting it destroy him. "So you decided to destroy my life the way you felt I'd destroyed yours," Ephraim said. "You took an innocent child and used her as bait. "I gave her a better life than she would have had in that shabby little town," Morrison replied. "I taught her to read and write properly, taught her about the natural world, gave her skills she'll need to survive. And in return, she helped me give you what you deserved, the experience of being hunted, suspected. You're cut off from human fellowship. You kept a child prisoner for 2 years to satisfy a grudge," James McKenna said, his voice thick with disgust. "You're sick." Morrison's gun swung toward McKenna, and Sarah screamed again. But this time, her scream was followed immediately by another sound, the deep, warning growl of a dog that had positioned himself between the threat and the people he'd decided to protect. Patches had been silent during the entire confrontation, but now he stood at the edge of the camp with his hackles raised and his teeth bared, every line of his body radiating the kind of focused aggression that comes from an animal defending its pack. And in that moment of distraction, as Morrison's attention flickered toward the dog, Ephraim made his move. Ephraim's dive toward Morrison was fueled by 26 years of guilt and the desperate need to protect an innocent child from paying any higher price for his wartime decisions. He hit the false doctor low and hard, driving his shoulder into the man's midsection just as the Colt discharged with a thunderous crack that echoed off the surrounding peaks. The bullet went wide, chipping stone from the boulder behind where James McKenna had been standing, but the impact of Ephraim's tackle sent both men tumbling across the rocky ground in a tangle of limbs and desperate violence. Morrison was younger and had the advantage of surprise, but Ephraim had lived a hard life in unforgiving country, and his body carried the kind of functional strength that came from decades of splitting wood, hauling water, and surviving Montana winters. More importantly, he was fighting to protect Sarah rather than to satisfy an old grievance, and that gave him a clarity of purpose his opponent lacked. They rolled across the uneven ground, each man trying to gain control of the gun that had tumbled from Morrison's grip when they collided. Morrison managed to get his hands around Ephraim's throat, his fingers pressing against the windpipe with murderous intent. But Ephraim drove an elbow into his ribs with enough force to break the hold and send Morrison gasping backward. Sheriff Bradley was shouting something, his own gun drawn, but unable to get a clear shot with the two men grappling so close together. Dr. Hayes had moved to shield Sarah and her father, though from this distance his medical bag would be of little use if the violence escalated further. Patches was barking frantically, circling the fighting men with the frustrated energy of an animal that wanted to help but couldn't distinguish between friend and enemy in the chaos. Morrison rolled away from Ephraim and lunged for his fallen colt, his fingers just touching the grip when Ephraim's boot caught him in the side, sending him sprawling again across the rocky ground. The gun skittered away from both of them, coming to rest near the edge of the camp, where the ground dropped away into a steep, talus slope. "Enough!" Sheriff Bradley roared, finally finding an angle where he could intervene without risking injury to Ephraim. His revolver was trained on Morrison, who had come up in a crouch with blood running from his nose and murder in his eyes. But Morrison wasn't finished. From inside his coat, he produced a long-bladed hunting knife, the kind of weapon that could kill a man quickly and quietly. The steel gleamed in the afternoon sunlight as he advanced on Ephraim with the practiced movements of someone who'd used such tools before. "I spent 2 years planning this," Morrison snarled, blood spattering from his split lip as he spoke. 2 years setting up the perfect revenge. "I'm not going to let it end with you playing the hero." Ephraim backed away carefully, his eyes never leaving the knife blade. He was unarmed except for his own hunting knife, still sheathed on his belt, but drawing it would mean taking his attention away from Morrison's advance for a crucial second, possibly a fatal second. "It's over, Morrison," he said quietly. "Sarah's safe, everyone knows the truth, and there's a dozen men within shouting distance who'll be here any minute. You can't win this, maybe not," Morrison replied, his voice carrying the cold certainty of a man who'd already accepted his own destruction. "But I can still take you with me. I can still give Daniel the justice he deserved." He feinted left, then lunged right with the knife leading. The blade aimed at Ephraim's heart with the precision of someone who'd thought about this moment many times. Ephraim twisted away, feeling the steel part the fabric of his shirt and score a line across his ribs that immediately began to bleed. The near miss put Morrison off balance for a moment, and Ephraim used that moment to draw his own knife, a shorter blade, but one he'd carried and used for 10 years in the mountains. The steel was well maintained and familiar in his hand, an extension of his will rather than just a tool. They circled each other warily now, 2 men with blades in a circle of stone with no room for retreat. Morrison had youth and desperation on his side, but Ephraim had experience and the kind of patience that came from years of hunting animals that were stronger and faster than he was. "Sheriff Bradley," Ephraim said, without taking his eyes off Morrison. "Get Sarah and her father down the mountain. Get them away from here, not leaving you to face this alone." "Cutter," Bradley replied grimly. "And don't let him get near that gun," Ephraim added, nodding toward the fallen colt. "Whatever happens here, don't let him get his hands on a firearm again." Morrison smiled then, a cold expression that held no warmth or sanity. "You still think you can control this situation, don't you? You still think your orders matter, that people will do what you tell them to do?" He raised the knife higher, the blade catching the light. "Let me show you what happens when your orders fail, Lieutenant. Let me show you what Daniel saw in those last few seconds before the Confederate bullets found him." The attack came with vicious speed, Morrison's blade describing a silver arc through the mountain air as he committed everything to a single, killing strike. The knife passed so close to Ephraim's throat that he felt the wind of its passage. But his years of hunting had taught him to read an opponent's movements in the split second before they committed to an attack. He stepped inside Morrison's arc, letting the blade pass harmlessly over his shoulder while driving his own knife upward toward Morrison's exposed ribs. Morrison twisted away at the last moment, Ephraim's blade scoring across his coat, but finding only fabric and the hard muscle beneath. The 2 men broke apart again, both breathing heavily now, both marked with small cuts and the beginnings of exhaustion that comes from fighting for one's life on treacherous ground. "You can't keep this up forever." "Old man," Morrison gasped, wiping blood from a cut on his cheek. "Age is going to tell, and when it does, I'll be there." But Ephraim wasn't listening to the words anymore. He was watching Morrison's feet, his shoulders, the subtle shifts in weight that telegraphed where the next attack would come from. This wasn't about age or youth anymore. It was about who had learned better lessons about survival in hard country. Morrison came again, this time in a series of quick probing strikes designed to test Ephraim's defenses and create an opening for a fatal thrust. The blade flickered in and out like a snake's tongue, forcing Ephraim to give ground toward the edge of the cliff where the camp dropped away into empty air. Behind them, Sheriff Bradley was shouting for Morrison to surrender, but his words seemed to come from very far away. Sarah's voice joined the sheriff's, high and desperate, calling for someone to help Mr. Cutter. But help was beyond reach now. This was between 2 men and the ghosts they carried. Ephraim's heel found the edge of solid ground, and he realized with cold clarity that he had perhaps 3 feet of space left before the rocky slope would send him tumbling down the mountainside. Morrison realized it too, and his next attack came with the confidence of a man who could see victory within reach. The thrust was perfectly aimed, driven with all of Morrison's remaining strength toward Ephraim's heart. But instead of retreating further, Ephraim did something Morrison hadn't expected. He stepped forward into the attack, catching Morrison's wrist with his left hand while driving his own blade home with his right. The point of Morrison's knife passed through the loose fabric of Ephraim's shirt and scored along his ribs. But the killing thrust was stopped by Ephraim's grip on his opponent's wrist. Morrison's eyes widened as he felt Ephraim's blade punch through his coat and into the flesh beneath his left shoulder. It wasn't a fatal wound, but it was deep enough to weaken Morrison's knife arm and send his weapon clattering across the rocky ground. He staggered backward, clutching his shoulder, his face pale with shock and pain. "It's finished," Ephraim said quietly, his own knife still held ready but no longer threatening. "Sarah's safe, the truth is known, and you're hurt badly enough that you need medical attention. Let it end here." But Morrison's response was to lunge not for his fallen knife, but for his original target, the Colt .45 that lay near the edge of the camp. His wounded shoulder made him clumsy, but desperation gave him speed, and his fingers closed around the grip, just as Sheriff Bradley's shot rang out across the mountain peaks. Bradley's bullet took Morrison high in the chest, spinning him around and sending him sprawling across the rocky ground. The Colt flew from his nerveless fingers, this time sliding over the edge of the cliff and disappearing into the talus below with a distant clatter. Morrison lay on his back, breathing in short, painful gasps, his eyes fixed on the sky above the mountain peaks. Blood was spreading across his shirt, and his face had the grey pallor that spoke of internal injuries beyond any help that Dr. Hayes might provide. Ephraim knelt beside him, pressing his own shirt against the wound in an attempt to slow the bleeding. But they both knew it was too late for such measures. "Daniel," Morrison whispered, his voice barely audible above the mountain wind. "I kept my promise, Danny. I made him pay." "Your brother wouldn't have wanted this," Ephraim said gently. "He was a good soldier, a decent man. He wouldn't have wanted you to destroy yourself for his sake." Morrison's laugh was bitter and filled with blood. "You don't get to tell me what my brother would have wanted. You sent him to die, I sent him to do his duty," Ephraim replied. "The same duty I was doing, the same duty we all accepted when we put on the uniform. War is full of bad choices and tragic outcomes, but that doesn't make every death a murder." Morrison's eyes were losing focus now, but his voice carried one last spark of the hatred that had sustained him for 2 decades. "I hope you carry this guilt for the rest of your life," he whispered. "I hope you remember that Sarah McKenna suffered for 2 years because of your failures." But his words no longer carried the power to wound. Ephraim had found something more important than his own guilt in the past few days. He'd found redemption in action, peace in protecting an innocent child rather than hiding from the consequences of old decisions. Morrison's breathing stopped, with the sun still shining on his face. His long quest for vengeance finally ended on a mountain peak, far from the Virginia battlefield where it had begun. 3 weeks after the confrontation on the mountain, Ephraim Cutter sat on the front porch of his rebuilt cabin, watching the first snow of winter drift down through the pine boughs like promises of peace to come. His hands were occupied with familiar work, carving another wooden cross, this one bearing the initials DM for Daniel Morrison, a young soldier who died at Chancellorsville and deserved better than to have his memory twisted into an engine of revenge. The cabin looked much the same as it had before he'd fled into the mountains, but small changes spoke of a life no longer lived in complete isolation. A second chair sat beside his on the porch, and inside, the shelves held supplies for more than one person. The changes weren't dramatic, but they were real, reflecting decisions made in the days following Sarah's rescue and Morrison's death. The sound of approaching horses interrupted his carving. James McKenna rode up the slope, leading 2 pack horses loaded with supplies, just as he had every few days since bringing his daughter down from the high country. Behind him rode Sarah herself, bundled in a heavy coat against the cold, but sitting her horse with the confidence of someone who'd learned to navigate difficult terrain. "Afternoon, Ephraim," McKenna called as he dismounted. The formality of Mr. Cutter had been abandoned in favor of something that approached friendship. Though both men were still learning how to navigate that territory, James, Sarah. Ephraim set down his carving and rose to help with the supplies. "How are things in town?" "Settling down," McKenna replied, though his expression suggested the settling had been more complicated than the simple words implied. "People are still talking, but the talk has changed. Pastor Morrison held a proper funeral for his brother last week, and Dr. Hayes has been making sure everyone understands what really happened up there. The revelation that the man they'd known as Dr. Morrison was actually Thomas Morrison, a drifter who'd assumed a dead physician's identity, had shaken Cedar Falls more than anyone wanted to admit. For 2 years, they'd trusted their children to a man whose only medical knowledge came from books stolen from the real Dr. Morrison's abandoned practice. The town's collective guilt over their suspicions of Ephraim had been matched by their horror at how completely they'd been deceived. Sarah climbed down from her horse and immediately went to where Batches lay sleeping in the afternoon sun. The dog had recovered from his ordeal and had officially become Sarah's companion, though he seemed to consider Ephraim's cabin his primary territory. The arrangement worked for everyone involved. "How are the dreams?" Ephraim asked Sarah quietly as she settled beside Patches. "Better," she replied honestly. "Dr. Hayes says they'll take time to fade completely, but they're not as frequent as they were." Dr. Hayes, the real Dr. Hayes, had been treating Sarah for the psychological effects of her captivity, and his assessment was cautiously optimistic. The girl had shown remarkable resilience, possibly because Morrison, despite his twisted motives, had never physically harmed her. His revenge had been more subtle, designed to isolate Ephraim rather than torture a child. "I've been thinking about something," Sarah said, looking up at Ephraim with the serious expression that had become familiar over the past weeks. "About the wooden cross you carved for me, the one with my initials." Ephraim nodded, remembering the cross he'd made during those long nights when sleep wouldn't come, and Sarah's disappearance had haunted his thoughts. "I'd like you to keep it," she said simply, "not as a memorial anymore, but as a reminder that sometimes the things we think we've lost can be found again." The words hit him with unexpected force. This child, who'd survived 2 years of captivity and manipulation, was offering him absolution for guilt he'd carried far too long. Not the military guilt over Daniel Morrison's death. That was something he'd learned to live with, a burden that came with the territory of making life and death decisions during wartime. But the guilt over Sarah's disappearance, the weight of undeserved suspicion and his own isolation, those burdens she was asking him to set down. "I'd like that," he said quietly. James McKenna had been watching this exchange with the careful attention of a father still learning to trust his daughter's judgment about people. The ordeal had changed Sarah in ways that would take years to fully understand. But it had also revealed strengths in her that her parents hadn't known existed. "There's something else we wanted to discuss," McKenna said, shifting to what was obviously the real purpose of their visit. "About your situation here." Ephraim waited, unsure what kind of proposal might be coming. "The town council met last week," McKenna continued. "They're offering you a position as a deputy sheriff if you're interested. Tom Bradley says he could use someone who knows the backcountry the way you do, especially during winter months when folks sometimes get into trouble up here." The offer surprised Ephraim more than he let show. A month ago, the people of Cedar Falls had viewed him with suspicion and distrust. Now they were offering him a position of responsibility and respect. "I appreciate the thought," he said carefully, "but I'm not sure I'm ready for that much human interaction." Sarah laughed, a sound that was becoming more frequent as she healed. "Mr. Cutter, you've had visitors almost every day since we came down from the mountain. Half the territory has been up here to hear the story firsthand and apologize for thinking badly of you." She was right, though Ephraim had been trying not to think too hard about the parade of visitors who'd made the journey to his cabin. Some had come out of curiosity, but many had come to express genuine regret for the way they'd treated him during the 2 years of suspicion. "Think about it," McKenna said. "No pressure, but the offer stands. In the meantime, we'll keep bringing supplies until you're ready to make regular trips to town yourself." As the afternoon grew later and the snow began to fall more heavily, the McKennas prepared to head back down the mountain. Sarah gave Patches a final pat and looked up at Ephraim with eyes that held wisdom beyond her years. "Thank you," she said simply, "for coming to find me, for not giving up when things looked bad. Thank you for being strong enough to survive until help could come," he replied. After they'd gone, Ephraim sat on his porch with the new wooden cross in his hands, watching the snow transform the familiar landscape into something clean and new. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear the sound of voices, other people living their lives in the territory he'd once thought of as his private refuge. The isolation that had once been his prison was becoming something different now, not a hiding place, but a chosen sanctuary that he could leave when he wanted to and return to when he needed peace. The wooden cross bearing Sarah's initials would sit on his mantle, not as a memorial to loss, but as a reminder that sometimes the things we think are endings are actually just beginnings in disguise. And sometimes, when a man runs toward the fire instead of away from it, he discovers that what he thought was his destruction was actually his salvation. Spring would come again to the Montana mountains, as it always did, bringing with it the promise of new growth from ground that had seemed barren and cold. But for now, winter was enough. Winter and peace, and the knowledge that some mysteries once solved set everyone free.